Hey, we're going to be in Psalm chapter 77 today. So if you brought a Bible, you can find the book of Psalms, which is roughly right in the middle of the Bible. Roughly right in the middle. It's in the Old Testament, the book of Psalms. We're going to be in chapter 77. If you need to use the table of contents to find your way there, that is perfectly okay. There's some paperback Bibles on the ends of your row. If you would like to have someone slide one down to you, you can track that way. Or you can also just Google Psalm 77 on your smartphone. And if you're looking at your phone, we'll just assume that you're reading the Bible. And if you're typing on the phone, that just means you're taking notes. That's what we do here in church. That's just how we roll. So Psalm 77 is where we're going to be today. This summer, we are spending some time in this book of Psalms, which is a book of prayer, and the big assumption behind this book is that our greatest need is to know God. Not just to know about God, but to personally know Him. So every one of us has a personal story as it relates to knowing God. For some of us, the story goes, my parents taught me from an early age to know God and to follow Jesus, and that's just been my story as long as I can remember. And others of us would say, my parents taught me to know God from an early age, but somewhere along the way, maybe it was high school, maybe it was college, it's often college, I just kind of drifted away from it. Until one day I realized I don't really follow Jesus anymore. Some of us would say, that's our story, but it fortunately didn't end there, because in the last few years, we've reawakened to the presence of God, and so some of us have recently restarted as followers of Jesus. And some of us here today would no doubt say, I'm sure there's a God who exists, but I've never been all that concerned about knowing or following Him. And even though that doesn't sound like a story, that's still your story as it relates to knowing God. So whatever your story, the book of Psalms says that God invites us to know Him. And He invites us to know Him in the midst of the normal circumstances and situations and events of our lives. In fact, in all different kinds of circumstances, in joy and in sorrow, in sickness and in suffering and in triumph, He invites us to know Him better. So for some of us today, He's inviting us to start. And for some of us, He's inviting us to restart. And for some of us, He's inviting us to more personally know Him than we have in the past. But He's always using the normal circumstances of our lives to invite us and to draw us to Himself if we have eyes to see what's happening. So Psalms is a book of prayer, and each prayer is written for a specific kind of situation. Each prayer invites us to know God through that particular situation. For example, last week, we looked at Psalm chapter 32, which is all about confession of sin and how confession draws us closer to the life of God. So that's a psalm about how to know God in the midst of sin, which is a crazy thought, right? God wants to use your sin to draw you closer to Himself and help you experience and know Him better. Ever thought of it that way? That's how Psalms work. They teach us to have a story with God in every kind of condition and situation we're in. Now, today we're going to do something really special. In a few minutes, we're going to get to hear one family's story with God through a particularly difficult season of their life. And I'm really excited to share their story with you. A couple of months ago, I asked them which psalm best expresses what you experienced as this chapter of your life was unfolding. And they told me it was Psalm chapter 77. So today, at their request, we're going to study Psalm chapter 77, and then we're going to have them up and we're going to hear their story, all while we're asking, what is God teaching us through this psalm and through their story? You got the flow? We're going to spend a few minutes in Psalm 77. We're going to have a family in our church up there. They picked this passage, so we're going to hear their story, and all the while we're going to be asking, what is God teaching us through this? Now, to get us into it, I want us to read how Psalm chapter 77 begins. And I want us to look just at the first 9 verses. So notice what's going on here when this psalm opens. I cry aloud to God, and He will hear me. In the day of trouble, I seek the Lord. In the night, my hand is stretched out without wearying. My soul refuses to be comforted. When I remember God, I moan. When I meditate, my spirit faints. You hold my eyelids open. I'm so troubled that I cannot speak. I consider the days of old, the years long ago. I said, let me remember my song in the night. Let me meditate in my heart. Then my spirit made a diligent search. Will the Lord spurn forever and never again be favorable? Has his steadfast love forever ceased? Are his promises at an end for all time? Has God forgotten to be gracious? Has he in anger shut up his compassion? Is that how you expect to experience God? Is that the circumstance through which you hope to know him better? Our author of Psalm 77 is Asaph, and we don't know a lot about him, but we know that he was a choir master in Israel's tabernacle. He was what we might call a worship leader, and he's in agony in this psalm. It starts out like this: I cry aloud, or literally, I cry with my voice, which in Hebrew was a way of emphasizing the intensity of his cry. Like, how many times have you been sad or depressed, but you're able to keep a straight face about it? Some of you probably even shook hands a few minutes ago, and it was like, how you doing? And you smiled and said, I'm good. While inside, you were really suffering. But we just know how to put a good face on things often. But have you ever been so down that you couldn't put a good face on it anymore? You had to physically scream. You had to just weep. You were so confused, you couldn't even put on the good face for your friends. You just had to openly, visibly weep and cry out. That's the situation here. Now look at what he's doing. He says in verse 2, in the day of my trouble, I seek the Lord. In the night, my hand is stretched out without wearying. My soul refuses to be comforted. When I remember God, I moan. When I meditate, my spirit faints. So this man is trying to find God in the middle of this awful situation, but he can't. It's like he's seeking, but he can't find. And he's reaching out for God, but it feels like God is not reaching back to him. He's meditating on his word, and he's coming up empty. So how can you know God better when you're in agony and it seems like God is absent? He's going to keep trying. Look at verse 4. You hold my eyelids open, and most commentators think that what's going on here is he's losing sleep. So it's like, God, you have thrust me in such agony that it keeps me awake at night. You hold my eyelids open. I'm so troubled, I cannot speak. But he's going to go, hey, as long as I'm awake, I might as well keep trying to find you. So he says in verse 5, I consider the days of old, the years long ago. I said, let me remember my song in the night. Let me meditate in my heart. And my spirit made a diligent search. But all he comes up with is unanswered questions. Has his steadfast love forever ceased? Are his promises at an end for all time? Has God forgotten to be gracious? Has he in anger shut up his compassion? And the answer to all those questions is like, I don't know. Have you ever been so troubled you thought, is God angry at me? Sometimes God doesn't act the way that you think he would act. And that's an invitation to know him better. Is that part of your Christian experience or your expectation of what following Jesus is sometimes like? Some of the most fruitful and effective saints in history have gone through deep seasons of discouragement and melancholy. The reformer Martin Luther, who was a man used by God in history-shifting ways, like there might not even be what we call a modern world without the Protestant Reformation that decisively ended the Middle Ages. So this man was used by God to reform a whole religion, Christianity, and to shift history. And he often suffered while he was being used in the very days that God was doing incredible things through him. He often suffered long bouts of depression. None other than Paul the Apostle, who in the first century was the man used more than any other to spread the Jesus movement throughout the Greco-Roman world, to make it not just a Jewish thing, but a whole world thing and a many cultures thing. Paul went through many, many difficulties and struggles. He once described his own struggle in a letter he wrote to a church he started in Corinth, and he began this letter called 2 Corinthians. He began by just telling them the agony that he had been through. This is 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 8. He goes, "We do not want you to be ignorant, brothers, of the affliction we experienced in Asia. We were so utterly burdened beyond our strength that we despaired of life itself." That was part of his experience as a servant of Jesus. After her death, Mother Teresa's letters were discovered and released, and they revealed that she had fought through decades of spiritual depression and loneliness and doubt. In 1950, Mother Teresa wrote, "Lord my God, who am I that you should forsake me? I call, I cling, I want, and there is no one to answer, no one to who I can cling, no one. Alone, I am told God loves me, and yet the reality of darkness and coldness and emptiness is so great that nothing touches my soul." People were shocked when that was discovered. Mother Teresa. Some even said, well, that proves that she was a phony, because a real Christian wouldn't say things like that. But that doesn't seem strange to you if you've read the scriptures and if you've read the Psalms. Now, right here, Christianity is unique among religions and spiritualities in how it deals with our emotions and how it deals with our feelings. Many spiritualities will try to teach you how to emotionally rise above suffering. And maturity becomes feeling nothing or achieving a state of tranquility that manifests in perfect calm in the midst of storms. Many people have just mapped that onto Christianity. And maturity then becomes either that the Christian is constantly cheerful. Like, how you doing, brother? I'm good, brother. You're good, brother? I'm good, brother. Good. Or stoic in the face of suffering. Either way, the negative emotions are avoided, or they're pushed down, or they're risen above. But Christianity doesn't actually hold that up as maturity. Some of the most mature Christians, that's not been their experience. Jesus himself was a sinless man, and he was in agony, and he sweated blood on the night before his arrest. At the cross, he cried out, echoing the Psalms, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Now, if that can happen to Jesus, can it happen to his followers? So Christianity does not deny or suppress emotion. Neither does it require a state of tranquility and calm. You might say it like this: it's okay to give full vent and full expression to your feelings. In fact, God gives us scriptures that he inspired, like these Psalms, that help us do just that. They give words to what we feel, especially when those feelings are agony. That's the first lesson to learn from this psalm. But notice that this man's emotions, though fully expressed, they don't have the final word in this psalm. So this psalm encourages us to express and to feel everything you're feeling, and not to let those have the last word. So you must listen to yourself and express yourself, but you also must preach to yourself. This psalm is also written to encourage us to seek and to listen for a word from outside. It says, during this time when the words from inside, honestly expressed, are all agony, you need a word from outside. Now that's what this man is trying to do. Did you notice that he's trying to remember God? He's trying to meditate. When God keeps him up at night, he's going, let me meditate in my heart, which is to take God's word into your mind and begin to let it seep into you. But he's trying to meditate, and he can't seem to get a foothold. But then it begins to change. In the second half of the psalm, he starts to get a foothold. Look at how verse 13 goes. Your way, O God, is holy. What God is great like our God? You are the God who works wonders. You have known your might among the peoples. With your arm you redeemed your people, the children of Jacob and Joseph. And now he's going to go into an extended meditation on the Exodus, which was the greatest act of redemption in Israel's history. When God took them out of captivity in Egypt and parted the Red Sea and led them through the Red Sea, and then Pharaoh's army was swamped in the sea. He's going to remember that. Verse 16, when the waters saw you, O God, when the waters saw you, they were afraid. Indeed, the deep tremble. The clouds poured out water. The skies gave forth thunder. Your arrows flashed on every side. The crash of your thunder was in the whirlwind. Your lightnings lighted up the world. The earth trembled and shook. That's how he defeated Pharaoh's army. And your way was through the sea, your path through the great waters, yet your footprints were unseen. You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. So he's beginning to get a foothold. Have you ever fallen down a really steep slope and you thought you were going to be plunged to your death, and suddenly your foot caught on something and it stopped your fall? Have you ever experienced that? Me neither, because I avoid hardcore climbing situations where I might plunge to my death. But some of you are hardcore. I see your Instagrams. Some of you do on Saturday what I would chalk up as like the accomplishment of a year. You're like, well, it's just Saturday. We did a 14er. I'm like, I did one of those once. The picture here is of a man who is plunging in verse 1 through 9, but then he catches his foot on something and he starts to get his balance in verse 13 through 20. And he's remembering what God has done in the past in the Exodus. He wasn't even alive during the Exodus, but he's meditating on it and it gives him a foothold. So this psalm flows, verse 1 through 9, full expression of my feelings. Verse 13 to 20, God's way is holy. He works wonders and redeems his people. Who is great like our God? Now, what's the difference between those two? What comes between verse 1 through 9 and verse 13 to 20? Verse 10, 11, and 12. Now look at how verse 10, 11, and 12 go. Then I said, I will appeal to this. And when you appeal to something, you remember it and you stake a claim based on it. So he's saying there's something I'm going to remember, I'm going to call to mind, and I'm going to hold God to this. I appeal to this, to the years of the right hand. The right hand is the hand of power of the Most High. That's his powerful name. I will remember the deeds of the Lord. Yes, I will remember your wonders of old. I will ponder all your work and meditate on your mighty deeds. So he begins remembering and meditating on God's work of old, and it steadies his fall. Now, some of us are probably thinking, how does meditating on God's past acts of kindness and rescue help us in the present? I don't just need a God who did something way back then at the Exodus. I need a God who can help now, today. How is that of any comfort that he once did something back then? Here's what Asaph knew. This God never changes. In fact, his past acts of kindness are a guarantee of his presence with us today and of his future kindness to us, even if it feels like he has forgotten us, even if it feels like he's absent. I know he doesn't forsake his people because he's never done that. He's always been present with his people. And he's always brought his people through. So, one of the cornerstone habits of Israel was to tell stories of God's kindness and rescue of his people, to encourage those in dark times that God will never leave you or forsake you. And if you're feeling forsaken today, the way out is not to run from God, but to draw closer to him. So Israel told stories like this one that we just read. In a couple of weeks, we're going to read Psalm 73, which was also written by this man Asaph, where he struggles with doubt. Have you ever struggled with doubt? He struggles with doubt. They told stories of God's kindness in the midst of confusion and doubt and darkness when he first seemed absent. So that's what we're going to do today. We recently got to see in our own church God's kindness in darkness. We got to see his presence to people who drew near to him when it was a mighty, mighty struggle to draw near to him. So I want to invite them up. Mark and Jen Shepard are going to come up and share with us today. Mark and Jen have been members here for several years now. You might recognize them. Mark recently went through our elder process and was one of our new elders. And years ago, they started being part of our church. And when you guys first came, you were just cool people. You were like a cool young couple. They were dinks. That means dual income, no kids. It's like the greatest season of life, really. And they traveled the world. They got married and took a year and traveled all over the world and produced an awesome coffee table book, which I think you still have a few copies for sale. It was incredible. It was incredible. It was like what we all dream of, right? Like quit work get married to the one and quit work and travel the world for a year. And then they came back and started back into life. And they started back into work, and now they have 2 sons who you're going to see here in just a minute. Colin is their first son, age 5, and Adam, age 3, and they have adult responsibilities. And in the last year, God plunged them into a really dark place, and they've really bravely today agreed to be here with us and to let us in on what they went through and to share it with us. So we put together a video that tells some of the story, and we're going to watch that together, and then we're going to come back and we're going to talk to him.
When he goes in for his pictures, he has to take a little nap, and he can't eat before his nap.
Why can't you eat? Because I don't eat anything. Because
then you get sick.
then I get sick.
Well, your MRI is at 7:45.
And how long will it be?
We have to check it at 6:45, so an hour. And then after it, we go upstairs. I'll put you in a wagon, and we'll go upstairs and talk to the doctor. Before kids, I was a teacher. He was a consultant. We finished the school year, quit his job, put all our stuff in my dog in my parents' basement, pushed the car there, and took off for a year to travel around the world. It was a contingency of his marriage proposal, and I said yes.
And then all of a sudden, at some point, you find yourself with a house and patio furniture and more stuff that can fit into the back of your sedan. And then all of a sudden, you wake up one day and you've got 2 kids too. You find yourself getting the call that no parent would ever want, which is your pediatrician saying after having reviewed some CAT scans that your kid has cancer. And that's where the story begins. So they gave us all the indications that it was a type of cancer called neuroblastoma, which can range in severity pretty severely. We got put into a box, and that box was that your kid won't make it, and therefore we can justify medical treatments to extend his life.
I just remember going through just a huge range of emotions. Like when we first got the phone call, I was just devastated. We went through a period of just utter desperation, and I was angry a lot at God about why would he do this to Colin? Why would he allow this? Why my kid?
And I remember vividly driving into Children's by myself. I dropped Adam off, and just weeping. Just probably an unsafe driver. But just weeping and just telling God, look, if this is where you're taking us, then he's yours. I trust that you love my son even more than I do.
So we get to the hospital, and Colin has to go through 2 hours of hydration. before the chemo starts. And they have the bag of chemo on the IV, and his port is hooked up to this hydration, and we get through 2 hours of it. But unbeknownst to us, our oncologist had been running around on the phone and whatnot. And she comes in and sits down and says, never had to do this before. Somebody jumped the gun. There's been a misdiagnosis. He's not stage 4. He's in fact downgraded to stage 3. And I asked the questions. I'm like, so what does this mean about chemo, radiation, all this? She just said, scratch it.
Colin and I went out to New York right before Christmas and made a fun time in the city, and went and saw this particular doctor. And fast forward through it, Colin went through a crazy, how long was the surgery?
8 hours.
8 hours. They got as close to his spine as they could get without risking paralysis. They had neurosurgeons in the operating room as well.
Our family said, whatever you need, our fellowship group, whatever you need. They put together meals and a whole litany of things to support us. Sunday school class, Colin's Sunday school class at church made him a quilt to wrap him in. I do know that the network of prayer was all over the country, from what I've heard. I don't even know half the people who were praying for him.
It's humbling to think that, on one hand, God's clearly showing Jen and I that something that's clearly out of our control, right? Something that we don't have the ability to determine an end state. He's shown us that, he's watching out for us, if that's probably an understatement. It's definitely an understatement. But he was there in the midst of all of
it. This ended in a really good place that we know of today. But you guys were really in the place where the psalmist was. In fact, you asked me to preach Psalm 77, which I hadn't honestly studied much before, because it really described what you felt and what you experienced in that unknown, in that darkness. And so I think what's interesting to me is you really had to, maybe for some of the first time in your life, you had to really feel helpless, which I think we have a lot to learn from. And Jen wrote up the story for me. You're an incredible writer. And this is what she wrote about that feeling of helplessness. She said, I'd always been the one giving and serving and helping. But now people are giving to independent, tough, got it together me. That was an unfamiliar, uncomfortable place for me to sit. So describe for us what that felt like more.
We wrote this down to prevent rambling, mostly Mark. He rambles. So it's true. I think for me, it's exactly what the psalmist says. When I meditate, when I think about anything, Colin, his stage 4 diagnosis, our future, God, my spirit faints. There was a moment for me that I clearly remember. Half this church came to the hospital one night to pray for our family when we were getting all our tests done, and for Colin. And I knew so many other people in our lives, and people we didn't even know were praying for him. I had just finished giving Colin a bath, and we were trying to take off a bandage, and I think that was the last straw for him that day. He just broke down. Between tears and shivers, he looked at me utterly despondent and asked, do all kids have a tumor in their bellies? And I just shook my head, and I held him close and until he fell asleep. And then I walked to the waiting room, and I saw so many people there to pray for him.
And they gave me the strength to pray too. And I think that night, way down deep, I let go of Colin. I knew he wasn't mine in the first place. He was God's. And then during his surgery, when we prayed that the surgeons would be able to remove the kid's football-sized tumor in his belly, when we prayed that he would wake up, that he would keep his kidneys, that he wouldn't be paralyzed. And every moment leading up to that and after, I had to let him go again and again and again. It's pretty helpless. You answered it.
Yeah, I think as you heard in the video, like there was kind of like Jen had too. There was an exact moment for me where I had to let Colin go, and it was very different. I mean, I every time I pray for the kids every night, I'm saying this, right? But for the first time, all of a sudden, what I was praying was, I was driving into the hospital. I'm like, I'm literally turning over my son to be slowly killed. The drugs they were going to put him on because he was in that stage 4 bucket would ultimately do severe harm to him. But they were all justified because of the nature of his diagnosis. We're buying him time, not a life. And so we rolling into the hospital. Chemo started that day. It's supposed to start a few times, but it was supposed to start again that day. And I let him go. And that was me giving him over to God. And I'd love to say, oh, it was this really easy thing. I have this great faith, and it was nothing like that. Like I was wrestling with God in this. It was through tears. It was through, as Jen said, anger at times. It was really hard, I think would be the succinct way of saying it. But I chose to trust that God loved Colin more than I did, which as a parent is nearly impossible to really believe, knowing how much you love your own kids. That God had a plan when I couldn't even see it or understand it. And I chose to acknowledge in my heart too that God's plan for Colin might not be the one that I wanted. Might not be the one that any parent would want for their kids.
You know, one of the things that I really like about the psalm that they chose is that it's written for the community of Israel. And even though it describes one man's experience, it draws on their communal redemption back at the Exodus, and it's written for the whole community. And so you guys had a lot of people who helped you. A lot of folks in our church were praying for you and supporting you. And there's times when we have to pray this for other people. Like they're not even strong enough to pray it themselves. And so now that you guys have been there and you've had so many people supporting you, I think you could really serve us well by telling us how we can help our friends and how we can help our family members. How can we help the members of our church community when they're in this place? Like tell us what we can do and maybe what we shouldn't do.
I don't think I have a list of do nots, but I just say that there were so many people that were present with Jen and I, and so many people that allowed us to honestly wrestle through this. It's so not black and white. There was just tremendous tension. We didn't know what was next. We didn't know still don't know what God's plan was. You guys allowed our faith to vacillate. I mean, many of you, as Hunter said, many of you in this room were praying with us and for us when we had no words, when our tears were kind of dried up. And to know in that darkness and that loneliness that there are dozens, if not hundreds, of people
that are interceding, that's tremendously comforting. I just remember we were alternating, Jen and I we were out in New York for a surgery. We were alternating nights between the Ronald McDonald House, and the pediatric ICU, and then the inpatient stuff. And we were cut off physically, right, from our community here in Denver. And I think there it became even more clear what our church and our family and our friends and everyone here had provided constantly for us. We just needed that freedom to choose God again and again and again. And we still choose God every day. Colin still has cancer around his spine. We've had 3 MRIs now since the surgery. Everything is stable, which is awesome. But we'll be doing MRIs for the next 7-8 years. And it puts us kind of squarely in the same place as any other parent, in that we don't know what tomorrow brings. Thinking of some actual examples, I just remember the emails we received from Linda Doran just sporadically throughout this whole thing, saying, we love you, we're praying for you, we're praying that God would give you strength. No need to respond. Like, just kind of a wonderful one-way communication where we didn't feel compelled to do anything other than receive it and know. Remember Andy Nelson made this cool book of like scripture and silly kid jokes. And we would walk around and tell the nurses the silly kid jokes when Colin was in a funk, and he'd run around telling the same knock-knock jokes over and over and over again. And the poor nurses would endure. Tabitha Betts they made this beautiful quilt out of the kids' classrooms downstairs. Jennifer Perez orchestrated meals for us. Our fellowship group, Jen's community Bible study, just enveloped us. Our families, I don't even know where to begin on that front, but our families were just, they grounded us when we were not emotionally grounded. Helped us make wise medical decisions for Colin. So many people did so many things to make Colin feel loved, and when Colin felt loved, we felt loved. There were posters, drawings, pumpkin bread. One of my favorites, videos of Dave's kids building a Lego war scene in Colin's honor that Colin watched again and again while hopped up on morphine in New York. FaceTime calls, when we were in the hospital. And in this, we had the freedom to wrestle with God. In this, I would say we experienced the true meaning of community. 1 Corinthians 12:26 says, and this is referring to the body of Christ that makes up the church, if one member suffers, all suffer together. If one member is honored, all rejoice together. And I guess I would just finish this off by saying we would thank you guys for suffering with us, for praying for us, for loving us. And the cool part about this story is that we get to rejoice together too.
There is an unknown future, but right now things are stable with Colin, which is really exciting. But I know that one of the things that you guys have, even after the fact, have continued to wrestle with is this whole question of like, why do we receive this good outcome, but many others don't? And that's a reality. And Jen, you wrote this really well. You expressed it better than I did. You said, why did my son receive a miracle of protection when all these other kids still living on the 7th floor of Children's Hospital, on the pediatric floor at Sloan's Kettering, at all the Ronald McDonald houses across the world do not? And these kids whose churches pray over them and lay hands over them and beseech God with every ounce of strength they have to save their son, and then watch them suffer and sometimes die. Why don't they receive a miracle too? Now, they don't think they're qualified to talk about this, but I think they do, because they really did have to release their son unknowing to the Lord and just give him to the Lord. So I think you're really qualified to help us here. What would be your encouragement to people who are in the middle of something and they don't know whether there will be healing or there will be death? And they don't know how it will end, or they don't know if it's going to end well. What would you say?
My heart really breaks over that. I can't imagine what I'm sure some people in this room have or are going through right now when it comes to sickness and suffering and death. I don't know what it would be like to go through chemo and radiation with Colin for months and years. And I don't know why God interceded for Colin and not for so many other kids that we've met. But I would say that I would pray that you would experience the height and depth of God's love for you during all of this. It's so easy to feel anger and desperation and helplessness, and I think it's okay. It's so much harder to feel love. I have to think about God and his own son. There's Jesus begging his Father to save him. Kind of like what you were talking about. He said, Father, if you're willing, take this cup from me, because he knew how hard it was going to be. And I have to think about God. He watched all of this. He watched people hurting his own son and mocking him. His kid had nails through his hands and his feet. People cursed him, even though he had done nothing but love them. And when God could have stepped in and saved his son, he didn't. He stepped in for Colin, but he didn't save his own son. He was silent, and there was no one to rescue him. He closed his eyes and he bowed his head, and he did it because he loves us so much, and Colin and me, and because he wants me to feel his unconditional love, because he wants me to know that I've done nothing to earn his love, but he loves me as I am. He doesn't want me to be separate from him in this really screwed up world. He wants me and Colin and you to be with him, surrounded by love forever. And I think that would be my prayer for others, that in whatever darkness you're in, because God chose you first, that you would choose God on a daily, hourly, minute by minute basis and allow him to love you and comfort you.
I love that you took us to what God did with his own son and giving his own son over, because it's emotionally compelling, but it's also good theology, which that's usually the way it works. If you'll let good theology have its way, it ends up being emotionally compelling. And so there's a reason in the psalm that the psalmist went back to the Exodus, even though the Exodus had happened hundreds of years before the psalmist wrote the psalm. There's a reason he went all the way back to the Exodus. And the reason he went back to Exodus is that Exodus was, in Israel's history, it was the greatest act of redemption. It was the ultimate act of redemption. There had been nothing greater since then. So he went back in his mind, using the scriptures, using the story he knew. He went back in his mind and in his heart to the ultimate act of God's redemption that he could bring to mind and he could find. And he went back there, and that's where he drew his understanding of God. That's where he drew his hope. And that's where he drew on this idea that God's past acts of redemption guarantee his future redemption to us and his current presence with us. He drew on that idea because he said God doesn't redeem a people only to leave them and forsake them. So he went to the greatest act. Now, what's incredible is, as you just told us, we have something even better than Exodus to go back to. In fact, it is the fulfillment of the Exodus narrative, and that is the death and resurrection of Jesus, the giving of God's own Son as the sacrificial lamb and the leading of him through the waters of death and ultimately to be resurrected. And so we have the greatest act of redemption to meditate on. And it so happens that it's 2,000 years before most of us were on the scene. But that's the ultimate act. And so to go there and to remember what God did in giving over his own son, to know that's how much he loves us. That's his guarantee. That's the guarantee that he's with us today. That's the guarantee he won't leave us or forsake us. And to remember the resurrection and say, that's the guarantee of our hope that is to come, because one day, even if our story ends in death, and it will for all of us at some point, then one day he is going to do for us and for the whole world what he did for Jesus, raise us from the dead and make this whole world into his kingdom. So God's past act of redemption guarantees his presence with us today and his kindness to us in the future. So in Romans chapter 8, Paul the Apostle said it like this. He said, "He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also with him graciously give us all things?" You see what he's doing there? In the past, God did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all. How will he not also in the future with him graciously give us all things? Now, what about the present? He says, "Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation or distress or persecution or famine or nakedness or danger or sword? No, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us." And so I really appreciate you guys leading us through this to what God did in giving his own son. And it's really incredible to think about. The agony that you experienced, our God knows more deeply than even you did, because he ultimately turned away from his own son, but rescued yours. So I want to pray over them now. We're going to move into the Lord's Supper, and we're going to remember what Jesus did for us, but I want to pray over you guys, and then we'll move to the table. Father, I thank you for my friends, and it was incredibly difficult to watch them go through this and to wrestle with you and to feel helpless, and even to feel helpless with them. And we thank you that you sustained them through this. We thank you that for the many people in this room, for many people who were gathered with us in the last service, who loved them and showed support to them and prayed for them. And Father, we have a celebration because of what you did and how you sustained them. And so we give you thanks. And I pray their story would draw us deeper into the heart of your Son, Jesus, and that you would help us to feel a measure, just a small measure of what you felt in giving over your own Son. Father, I pray we would be assured of your love for us. We'd be assured of your presence with us. We would be confident in our future because of what you've done in giving him. And so as we come to the table, would you give us that taste and that experience now? We ask it in his name and by his Spirit. Amen. Thanks, guys.